I would like to share an intriguing chess strategy that involves surprising your opponent. Typically, opponents expect you to focus on achieving checkmate, but this strategy involves targeting their queen instead. By adopting this approach, you can gain a significant material advantage, which can ultimately lead to a victory later in the game. Let's begin with this trap. Let's explore another interesting trap that often works against more advanced opponents, but may not be as effective against beginners. In this trap, after white plays pawn to d4, you respond with knight to f6. After white plays pawn to c4, you sacrifice the pawn with pawn to b5. White captures the pawn, and you advance your knight to e4. Usually, white plays knight to f3, which is the most common move. Here, you play pawn to b6, pretending that you want to fianchetto your bishop to b7. If your opponent is more advanced, they may notice the critical flaw in pawn b6 and play queen to d5, launching a double attack. This move is what you want them to play, but beginners may not notice it. In response to queen to d5, you play bishop to b7, sacrificing the bishop. After white captures the bishop, you play knight to c6, intending to trap the queen later. There aren't many squares for the queen to go, and queen to a6 is usually the only available square. If white plays almost any move, you play knight to c5, trapping white's queen completely. White has to be concerned about their position and tries to escape by playing queen to a6. You play bishop to b4 check, gaining tempo, and putting one more piece around white's king, limiting the squares where the queen can retreat. After bishop to d2, you play your winning move, knight to c5. The queen is attacked, and the only square for the queen to go to is b5. Now, you can win the queen by playing pawn to a6, but it's even stronger to trade the bishops first. Otherwise, your opponent can get two minor pieces for the queen. You trade on d2 first, then play pawn to a6, ultimately winning the queen. Moving on to another trap, we'll focus on an opening known as the Scandinavian defense e4 d5. After knight to c3 and queen to a5, we enter the main line. Instead of playing pawn to d4, which leads to a lot of theory, we play pawn to e3. This move is a little provocative and aims to exploit a common mistake made by many opponents. When your opponent plays bishop to g4, a move that seems uncomfortable for you, you play pawn to h3. Surprisingly, this move makes bishop g4 incorrect and gives you an advantage. If the bishop retreats, you can pressure it with pawn to g4, potentially placing your bishop on g2, advancing your attack while gaining extra tempo. Black finds themselves at a disadvantage. If your opponent decides to trade on d3, you respond by capturing with the queen, simultaneously targeting the b7 pawn. Black's plan to develop the knight to c6 and potentially castle and play knight to d4 is not allowed. Instead, you play bishop to e5, pinning the knight and threatening to capture it, as you attack it twice. Black's only way to defend the knight is with the slightly awkward move queen to b6. But now comes the winning shot, knight to d5, attacking the queen. If the queen captures the bishop, you respond with knight takes c7, forking the king and queen, achieving your goal of winning material. Keep in mind that these traps require careful play and are more effective against opponents who are not familiar with them. Let's imagine you're playing a game of chess as black. Your opponent starts with the move pawn to d4, hoping for a queen's gambit. Instead of playing pawn to e6, which is expected, you surprise your opponent by playing pawn to e5, counterattacking. White will usually respond with pawn to d5, creating some problems for white, as they can't develop their knight normally. In order to develop their bishop, they have to move the pawn, so they often play pawn to e3, hoping to trade off the pawn. However, you play bishop to b4, confusing your opponent once again. When white covers with bishop to d2, expecting a bishop trade, you play pawn takes e3, setting up a trap. Your opponent notices that they can win a bishop for nothing and captures on f2. However, king takes f2 is not an option for white, as it would lose the protection of the queen, allowing you to win it. Instead, white plays king to e2, hoping to maintain the guard of the queen. Here, you have a rare opportunity to underpromote in a practical game by promoting to a knight, delivering a check to the king. White captures the knight, but then you play bishop to g4, adding another attack to all of white's vulnerable pieces. Ultimately, you win the queen on the next move. If your opponent starts with the move pawn to e4, they are doomed to lose no matter what they try. You have already analyzed 903 variations and found ways to win the queen against this move. Another common move is pawn to f4, known as the king's gambit. You play pawn to d5, sacrificing a pawn to gain the initiative and set up an attack. After pawn takes d5, you continue sacrificing pawns with pawn to c6, confusing your opponent once again. At this point, it becomes difficult for white to figure out what to do. The king is a bit exposed, and they have to worry about potential checks with h4. The most popular move for white is pawn to g3, and you play pawn to e4 to attack the knight. The knight jumps forward to d5, justifying the pawn on f4, as it now defends the knight. You play bishop to c5, annoying white and showing that they won't be able to castle easily. White plays bishop to b5, creating a pin against your knight. It seems like they can take the knight twice, but you calmly ignore it and play knight to f6. If white takes the knight on c6, hoping for a double attack, you play bishop to d7. After white wins the rook, they are happy, but you surprise them by saying, "Wait a second, you won a rook, but I'm going to win a queen." You play bishop to g4, trapping white's queen on its original square. This is a rare case, and you not only win a queen, but also continue your attack against white's exposed king. You are completely winning in this position, and you can even consider moves like queen to d4 or queen to g2 to further your advantage. You can stick to your regular move, such as playing pawn to e4, which is commonly seen in this situation. If your opponent opts for the Scandinavian defense, one of black's main choices, you can transition into the Smith-Morra gambit. After playing pawn to c3 and sacrificing the pawn with pawn captures knight on c3, you gain a development advantage and long-term initiative. Typically, black responds symmetrically with knight to c6 after knight to f3. At this point, black realizes the potential threat of your move pawn to d4, attacking their knight, and often prefers to play pawn to d6 to prevent your pawn from advancing and then safely develop their knight to f6 without worrying about potential attacks. However, you disrupt their plans by playing bishop to c4, which prompts black to play knight to f6. Despite black's response, you proceed with pawn to d4, putting black in a difficult position. This trap is often unfamiliar to opponents, leading them to make mistakes and fall into your dangerous attack. For example, if black captures your knight on c3 with their knight, you happily recapture with pawn takes c3, but you don't trade queens because your goal is to win black's queen. Instead, you capture on d8 first, employing a tactical motif seen in previous traps. After black's king captures on d8, you secure a winning position by capturing the queen. If you are an experienced double player, you may already be familiar with the previous trap in the Scandinavian defense. However, the next trap will likely be new to your opponents, giving you an advantage. You can enter this trap against the Scandinavian defense if you start with pawn to e4, and after black responds with pawn to d5, you play knight to c3. Alternatively, you can force your opponent into this variation regardless of their initial move. In either case, you begin with knight to c3, an uncommon move that is perfectly acceptable as you develop a piece. Black's most popular response is pawn to d5, aiming to control the center and potentially create threats. You then play pawn to e4, feigning an exchange offer. After black captures your pawn, instead of immediately recapturing, you play bishop to c4. Your opponent might think they can now defend the pawn with knight to f6, but you continue with pawn to d3, again appearing to offer a trade that you never intended to accept. When black captures on d3, you continue playing in a gambit style with knight to f3, developing another piece. Since your opponent is accustomed to your apparent material losses with each move, they might gladly capture one more pawn on c2. However, instead of capturing back with queen takes c2 or queen takes d8, you already know the trick. It's time to sacrifice your bishop with bishop takes f7, surprising your opponent, who thought their pawn was attacking. By ignoring the threat and sacrificing your bishop, you follow the same motif of capturing the queen with queen takes d8, securing a winning position.
Begin with the move knight to f3. Usually, opponents respond with moves like pawn to e5 or pawn to d5 in different openings. However, in this case, capturing on e5 is not possible because you'll capture the pawn. The most common move from opponents is pawn to d5. Now, surprise them with the move pawn to e4, which may seem like a blunder. They might capture the pawn, thinking it's an opportunity. That's what most opponents would do. Now comes the crucial move, knight to g5. The aim is to regain the lost pawn by targeting their pawn on f7. Naturally, your opponent will develop their knight to defend the pawn. Respond with pawn to d3, attacking their pawn on d5 twice. Your opponent may be happy to trade pawns, thinking they have an extra pawn advantage. However, what they may find annoying is your knight on g5, which exerts pressure on their position, especially when combined with your bishop. To relieve the pressure, the top move for black in this position is often pawn to h6. Now, surprise them with the explosive move knight takes f7. This move instantly wins the game within a few moves. The knight not only forks the queen and the rook, but also forces black to capture it. This leads to a discovered attack with bishop to g6, checking the king while simultaneously winning the queen on the next move. This grants you a significant material advantage, setting you up for victory. This trap has been successful even against higher-rated opponents, making it a valuable tactic to employ. If you have any questions about alternate moves from black, I have a more detailed video analysis linked in the description below. Feel free to check it out. Now let's move on to fooling your opponent as black. Your opponent starts with the most popular move, pawn to e4. You respond with knight to c6, knight to f3, and bishop to c4. At this point, it's a good idea to start seriously assessing the position, pretending to think about your next move. After some consideration, you play knight to d4, seemingly intending to trade knights. However, your opponent will notice that this move actually loses the pawn on e5. Instead of trading knights, it appears more advantageous for white to win a pawn on f5, also attacking the pawn on f7. At this point, it's time for some acting skills. Shake your head and act confused. After a bit of contemplation, play the move queen to g5, seemingly out of desperation, hoping for counter chances. However, this move is actually a well-known trap. Queen to g5 double attacks the knight and the pawn on g2, causing problems for white. White is already in a difficult position and will likely lose the knight on f3. Despite losing a pawn, you gain a significant advantage. White may still be optimistic since capturing the pawn on f7 hits the queen and the rook, seemingly winning the pawn. However, you capture the pawn on g2, threatening queen to h1, which almost leads to checkmate, as your knight restricts their king's movement. At this point, you are clearly winning. If white plays rook to f1, for example, you respond with queen. Continuing from the previous moves, let's say you play queen to e4, delivering a check to the opponent's king. At this point, your opponent may realize that they are destined to lose because they have to give up their queen. If they play queen to e2, allowing you to capture their queen, it results in a decisive material advantage for you. However, if they play bishop to e2 instead, it leads to a humorous checkmate known as smothered mate, with knight to f3. taking advantage of the pinned bishop and delivering checkmate in a clever manner. Let's explore an alternative strategy that guarantees the capture of your opponent's queen. Regardless of their move, they are destined to lose their queen against you. Suppose they play pawn to d4, a common move. We have a solution for this situation as well. After d4, we will proceed with 45 gamut, pushing our pawn forward. Following that, we play bishop to c5, developing our piece. Typically, your opponent responds with knight to f3, which is the most frequently played move according to the database. Now, we play pawn to d6, another ordinary move, pretending that we are simply developing our pieces. Here, it's important to note that if you're playing an online blitz game, it's advantageous to quickly lay your next move. This gives the impression that you pre-move the knight to jump on e7, anticipating your opponent's developing move. They might capture the knight, believing they are winning the game. However, that's when you unleash a powerful counter-move, bishop takes f2. This unexpected move forces the opponent's king to move, thereby exposing the queen's vulnerability. We seize the opportunity and capture the queen, achieving our goal. But the traps don't end there. Even titled players have fallen for this deceitful strategy. Starting with the move pawn e4, if your opponent responds with pawn to f5, you can sacrifice the pawn by playing knight to c3, attacking the pawn and aiming to regain it. Black usually defends the pawn by playing knight to f6. At this point, you realize you can reclaim your pawn by playing pawn to f3. Once your opponent captures it, you recapture with your queen, a move that not only prepares for potential castle queenside but also offers significant compensation despite sacrificing pawns. While your opponent may notice your repeated pawn sacrifices, where black can safely capture pawns on d4, gaining an advantage, you counter by playing bishop to e3. Developing your bishop with a tempo. This move helps maintain your development and provides considerable compensation. Your opponent will likely contemplate their next move, with one common choice being queen to b4, appearing advantageous as it retreats and counterattacks the pawn on b2. This move seems to initiate a sequence where black can attack your rook and knight, and even threaten your castle queenside. However, the refutation comes with the move 9 to b5, a high-level maneuver difficult for black to foresee. This move sacrifices the queen and creates a checkmate threat in one move with knight takes c7. Due to this impending checkmate, black cannot capture your queen, as knight takes c7 leads to an immediate checkmate. Additionally, the black rook on a8 is blocked, preventing any interference. Black struggles to defend their pawn, especially considering the interference caused by the knight on b5, impeding the defense of the pawn on b7. In addition to knight takes c7, you have another powerful threat, queen takes b7. Executing this move would result in complete devastation for black, as your queen would attack the rook and knight, possibly even targeting c8. Consequently, some opponents might opt to sacrifice their queen by playing queen takes b5, preventing an immediate checkmate. However, the primary goal was to win the opponent's queen, and victory can still be achieved. You gain a substantial material advantage, setting you on a winning path. If you are interested in exploring further variations and strategies, I have another video dedicated to this specific approach. Nonetheless, if you prefer not to engage in these special trap openings, you can continue with your usual moves and tactics. That concludes our discussion for today. We'll reconvene in the next episode of Get Smart. Take care and stay tuned for more insightful content.